If you want to sit down now, because we'll be starting right now. Thank you. They're coming slowly. If somebody may call the people in the coffee room, because we'll have to start now, not to be late. Oui, les bouteilles en verre. Si vous voulez, il y a des capsules. Alors, vous voulez qu'on l'ouvre? Ah oui, elle est très forte. Il faudrait mettre une petite... Okay, so we start this session. This first session is a time of analysis, exploring the social challenges in Europe today and the road to recovery. And we'll have two speakers, Professor Cecile Renoir, who was professor at Centre Sèvres in Paris and also at ESSEC Business School, Sciences Po, and École des Mines Paris Tech in Paris too. And we have also Professor Milos Lischner from Society of Jesus, Faculty of Theology, Vice Rector of Drama University in Slovakia, and former President of the European Society for Catholic Theology. May I introduce myself? I'm Antoine Roy, President of the Comité Social Affairs Commission, and I'm pleased now to introduce our first speaker, Professor Cecile Renoir, who is here with us for this first session. Trained in economics and commerce, you completed your education with studies in theology and philosophy, which led you to write a thesis of political philosophy. Your research focuses on the different contributions of companies to development through taxation as well as through social and societal engagement. In 2016, you co-founded the Campus of the Transition, Campus de la Transition, a training and research institution dedicated to the ecological and social transition in France. With an interdisciplinary team of researchers, You're working in particular on the social responsibility and societal performance of multinational companies in the South, and more specifically of oil companies in Nigeria. Religious of the Assumption, you're a professor of philosophy at the Centre Sèvres, Jesuit faculty in Paris. You're also teaching at the Paris École des Mines and at the ESSEC Business School, where you are the founder and the scientific director of the research program Corvette Company and Development, which highlights the need for implementation of ethical and political responsibilities by private actors. You are the author and the co-author of several books, including 20 Proposals for Reforming Capitalism, 2012, Ethics and Business, 2015, Business and the Climate Challenge, 2015, and the Great Transition Handbook, 2020. You're also a member of the International Association Human Development and Capability Association, founded by Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen. We are very honored to welcome you today in Bratislava, and please, the floor now is yours.
Thank you for this introduction. Eminences, Excellencies, brothers and sisters, I must say first that it was very difficult for me to prepare this presentation in the dramatic context that affects us all. I felt and I feel very helpless. What could I say about the current European context that is in such uncertain context? I only propose to give some tools and reference points that may resonate with your different contexts. My remarks are partly linked to the ecological crisis, which is a time bomb for our societies and economies. I think that the current war illustrates the articulation between geopolitical, energy, economic and social issues. The Pope expression, everything is linked, also applies here. I'll just mention of Saint Martin, who traveled many roads across Europe and passed through many city gates in his history to proclaim Christ and support the weakest. I would like to use this image of gates and roads to analyze the current situation and the discernments to be made. So, as was just said, where I speak from, the initiative of the Campus de la Transition is a way to try to integrate or to help higher education institutions to integrate integral ecology in the curricula, in the day-to-day life of students, but also researchers, professors, and at the campus, we are a very small institution, but we welcome students, professors, and professionals from different contexts and try to analyze the situations with them and the challenges. And I would like to use the methodology that we have developed at the campus to talk about the socio-economic challenges in Europe. This involves 6 gates that are like 6 entry points. This is in order to better understand the transformations to be made. So I will present 6 gates and 3 horizons. Let's say a word about the Great Transition Handbook is a book that has been written with like 70 scholars having different experience in different disciplines, and we try to promote and to propose a transdisciplinary approach using these 6 gates. And to make you really active in this session, I would like to reflect on your preferred gate. I mean that each one of us has a different way of approaching the issues we face, and in particular the challenges of the ecological, social and economic transition. Either by diagnosing what is happening in our common home, that the gate oikos in our work, or by being indignant in the face of injustice and structural injustice, and reflecting on the conditions for living well, at the ethos gate, by looking for appropriate rules of the game, that's nomos, by highlighting stories of a desirable life, that's logos, by taking action on different scales, that's praxis, and by reconnecting with oneself, with others, and with the whole of creation and with God, that's dynamis. So if you can take just a few seconds to ask yourself, what is your privileged entrance gate? Of course, all of us have to go through all these gates, but we may have one preferred one. So if you could raise your hand, those for whom the privileged entrance door is oikos. Ethos. Nomos. Logos. Praxis. And dynamis. And that's always amazing because all the 6 gates, the 6 doors are represented. And I think in terms of education, it's interesting to see, and I see this a lot at the campus, we have young engineers who are very often very interested in oikos, first in the diagnostic, but for others it's praxis, for others it's ethos or dynamis. So our entry points are not the same. Then I would like to present very briefly another approach that is very helpful to us, and I think it may be helpful for all of us in order to reflect on the necessary changes in the 3 horizons approach. This framework has been proposed by Bill Sharp, who is the former HP research director. And I discovered this approach when I spent a few months at Schumacher College in England a few years ago before creating the campus. 3 horizons, H1, H2, H3. There are 3 ways to look at our reality and to consider changes. Horizon 1 draws the business as usual, the current context with all its constraints. Horizon 3 depicts the desirable future, and Horizon 2 shows the path to go from Horizon 1 to Horizon 3. And the question is to know whether the H2 trajectories are H2 plus, it means significant changes, or H2 minus, it means greenwashing. And I suggest here for each one of you to take 1 minute just to think about the challenges that you have to face in your position and in your country, and maybe just express on a paper one dilemma that is really maybe the major dilemma for you at a personal level, and then another dilemma at a structural or collective level. And these dilemmas can be related either to H3, because sometimes we think that we agree on H3, on the goals that we have to pursue, and it's not sure. And the many dilemmas, of course, are linked to H2 trajectories. Are they H2 plus or H2 minus? So just 1 minute in silence, just to reflect on 2 dilemmas at a personal or structural level. So I propose to use this 3 horizons approach to reflect on the situation in Europe. I will first present a few things about the situation in Europe and then broaden the perspective to issues that are both European issues and also global issues that are interrelated. So about H1 issues, just mention briefly the Ukraine war, health post-COVID issues or COVID issues, and financial stakes. About the war in Ukraine, we don't know yet the extent of the social and economic consequences for the Ukrainians, for the Russians, and for all European countries. The Russian war is a source of tremendous suffering and is generating several structural changes for our economies. We can say that first, the economic sanctions illustrate our dependence on hydrocarbons and will contribute to strategies to reduce this dependence. Second, it will increase food prices, and we know that Russia is the world's largest producer of wheat, and Ukraine is fifth, and Ukraine is the world's largest producer of corn. So this has consequences not only for European countries, but many countries around the world and in Africa particularly. And third, this will lead also to probably to a massive increase in military spending in the West. And the geopolitical context makes ecological and health issues, we could say, more distant on the one hand, but also more acute on the other. So about these health COVID or post-COVID issues, the pandemic illustrates our vulnerabilities and interdependencies. It is what the scientists call a zoonotic disease, meaning that the virus, which is now spreading through human populations, originated in another animal species. It showed the links between human and environmental issues and the importance of global health. The notion of One Health links human, animal, and environmental health. And from this, we can reflect on the populations who are most at risk for severe forms of COVID-19. There are, of course, the elderly people or people with chronic diseases, but among vulnerable population, we find also homeless people, migrants, communities excluded from healthcare systems, and also young people. Many have experienced mental diseases related to the COVID crisis. We can say that the COVID crisis has shown the failure of many public authorities' strategies to prepare for pandemic health risks. And the work of ecologists showed that it is a development of industrial agriculture with deforestation and commercial plantation that is the cause of many health risks. We could have hoped that the pandemic could be an electroshock to deeply change our economic models. The pandemic has increased the level of public indebtedness of states. It has also led rich countries to strengthen their research and development and industrialization policies. It was an opportunity to reflect on what was called the world after. And in fact, when we look at the figures, economic activities has picked up. So this leads me to financial and economic stakes for Europe. The Three Horizons approach can be understood as a way to answer the tragedy of the horizon. This was how Mark Carney, who is the former governor of the Bank of England, he expressed his concern in 2015. And he said that climate change is what he called the tragedy of the horizon. The challenges posed by climate change will have broader global impacts on property, on migration, on political stability, as well as on food and water security. And he showed that climate change can affect financial stability in three ways. He speaks of physical risks arising from climate and weather-related events. And I think we all have in mind in Europe the deadly floods in Germany and Belgium last summer. There are some liability risks, impacts that could arise tomorrow if parties who have suffered loss or damage from the effects of climate change seek compensation from those they hold responsible. And finally, you have the transition risks, changes in policy, technology and physical risks that could prompt a reassessment of the value of a large range of assets. So, to summarize, risks to financial stability will be minimized if the transition begins early and follows a predictable path that could help the markets anticipate the transition to a 2-degree world. And what we can say, if I go back to the last IPCC reports, and now I move to H3 and H2, that in fact our current trajectories show that we are very far from being up to these current challenges. It means that we have to reflect on the kind of economic models that we have to promote. If I take the expression used by Tim Jackson 10 years ago, he spoke of prosperity without growth. How can we promote and what the Pope called the quality of life while decreasing the GDP per capita, at least in our countries and for the medium class and upper class people? Of course, it doesn't. We have, as we already mentioned a lot this morning, we have to make sure that this situation won't be worsened for people who are already the poorest in our societies. So the question is, how can we promote integral ecology in action? And it means that we really have to think of degrowth in some parts of our economic models. I just remind us that in 2020, the European GDP fell by 6%. In 2021, the growth is 5%. For 2022, it's too soon to say, but the estimations are around 4%. And this GDP growth is still dependent on fossil fuel consumption, which is completely unsustainable. That means that we have to reflect on these decarbonized and fair societies, and so to face many challenges. So now I would like to go back on some H1, H3 and H2 plus challenges at a global level. Challenges that all of us know are about, in terms of challenges for the work today, modern slavery along the value chains, not in our countries, but all our economies depend on these extractivist models. Then we have what David Graeber called the bullshit jobs. Part of the population in our countries find that their jobs are either useless or are harmful for others. And you have also all the problems related to digitalization and the loss of employment of jobs. So that's broad. Tomorrow afternoon there will be some more details on the situation in terms of CO2 and the history of CO2 in the atmosphere. Here you have a graph that shows that we are completely out of the climatic stability. We have reached the level of 410 ppm. And we know that if we want to limit the global warming to less than 2 degrees, we have to return to 350 ppm. So challenges are really huge. You have, I mean, that maybe all or maybe majority of you have in mind this, what scientists call the great acceleration. And many uncertainties, both in terms of geophysical data, but also in terms of socio-economic trends. This, what they call great acceleration, is related to rare metal wars. Many conflicts have already emerged and will emerge for exploitation and production of metal. If I take only one example, the example of copper. Copper is considered as a strategic metal by many states, as its importance is crucial for some industries, of which transports. Extraction is very unevenly distributed over the globe. Chile alone concentrates around 28% of world production. And Chilean authorities have announced that the mining industry will have its water extraction permits limited, especially in areas of the country that are highly water stressed. And Russia is the 7th largest producer of copper and produces large quantities of metals. And I studied a little bit more the situation in France in terms of needs for copper in the next decades. And it's very impressive to see that for France alone, if we were to an energetical mix 100% renewable, and with 100% renewable energies, we would need 3% of the global production of copper every year. So, of course, it raises many social justice issues. So it says something about the enormous constraints that all of us have to face. Now, if I take the energy issues, the Ukrainian war reveals the European gas supplies dependence. Russia supplies about 40% of Europe's gas. It's also another reason to think about sobriety or frugality and sufficiency. I will come back to this topic just after. And here I just mention among the major inequality that our world faces, COVID-19 vaccination inequalities. Vaccines against COVID-19 are far from representing a global public good. They were very unequally distributed. The governments of the richest countries have negotiated in opacity with pharmaceutical companies for pre-orders of vaccines under development. The COVAX initiative launched by the World Health Organization and the Gavi Alliance to promote the distribution of vaccines in countries of the global south has received insufficient support. The result is a glaring inequality in access to vaccines on a planetary scale. You see that at the beginning of February 2021, so a year ago, 7 countries concentrated 80% of the doses administered in the world, most of them in the global north. Being vaccinated offers an immunoprivilege for some, but serves as a basis for discrimination in terms of participation in community life, mobility and employment for the others. And very recent negotiations 2 days ago between the US, the European Union, India and South Africa have led to the decision to only partially remove intellectual property rights on pharmaceutical products for the fight against COVID-19. Maybe you have seen on the newspapers that this decision does not satisfy either the Western pharmaceutical companies and on the other side, the NGOs who find it insufficient. Concerning other global inequalities, here you see how the CO2 emissions associated with the consumption of different global income groups from 1990 to 2015, as well as the depletion corresponding to the global carbon budget aimed at limiting warming to 1.5 or below 2 degrees. You see that the 10% richest of humanity are responsible for 52% of the cumulative emissions, consuming almost a third of the carbon budget worldwide. And on the other side, you have the bottom 50% generated only 7% of emission accumulated and consumed only 4% of the budget. So it's a question here also of social justice, especially when we talked about who pollutes and who will have to suffer the consequences of global warming. About our common and differentiated responsibilities, I think we can reflect on the responsibilities owned by some companies, and here you have figures concerning fossil fuel companies, but we can also reflect on the responsibilities of the countries, and for example, on our European Union countries, and at the EU level, a plan to adopt a border carbon tax has been postponed until this summer. It would be to establish a surcharge for imported products according to the CO2 emissions generated by the production. And this would concern 5 areas: iron and steel, cement, fertilizers, aluminium, and electricity and production. This would be also a way to try to integrate in our economic models these social and more here ecological constraints and boundaries. So here also, if we look at internal displacement, you see the figures, and you see that internal displacements were most of them in Asia and in Africa in the recent years. We can just mention the dramatic situation for Ukrainians because according to the figures I've seen recently, there were more than 2 million people that have been internally displaced, and more than 3 million people that have fled Ukraine since the Russian invasion. So it says something about the great uncertainties that we have to face, and this current exodus is without any precedent in this century for its speed. So now this is the H1 situation. If I now move to the H3 world that we would like to promote, sometimes what we can try to look at, that the situation that we would like to prevent. And I just show here a graph published by the IPCC report on the, it would be the worst scenario in terms of high temperature and deadly humidity when you have temperature that is higher than 37 degrees and humidity equal to 100%. The sweat does not evaporate, and a healthy person can die in a few hours. And you see that all the zones in red would be zones where you wouldn't be able to live. So this shows us that the great challenge is to promote economies within the donut. You may be aware of what Kate Howers mentioned in terms of donut economics. It means trying to create wealth while respecting a social floor and an environmental ceiling, and respecting what the Stockholm Resilience Center on Resilience, they speak of 9 boundaries, and you see that in red we are above these boundaries, so we are above the thresholds. So our challenge is try to change these economic models in order to reduce our ecological footprint and both promote development. And here on the graph, you see on one axis the Human Development Index used by UNDP in order to see the situation of the countries in terms of GDP per capita, access to education, and access to health. And you have also on the other axis the ecological footprint. And on the corner, in the right low corner, you see that ideally H3 would be having countries in this quadrant. It means that for the time being, no country is there. So how can we reduce? And for European countries, it means that reducing our ecological footprint. This supposes for all of us to reflect on designing desirable and sustainable lifestyles. Just put here pictures of either smart buildings, frugal cities, eco-villages. in France, because we are just before the presidential election, a network of engineers has just published a plan to transform the French economy and the detailed ways to ensure the decarbonization of our production system and our consumption in the following areas: agriculture and food, ecological renovation of buildings, mobility, and digital technology. What these engineers want to show, and we are really in the oikos perspective, is that there are some paths that are possible, that exist, but they require a strong political will and investment choices. And we have some economists who have suggested to remove investments from the investment in these ecological economies, to remove them from the calculation of the public deficit, and to have them financed by a European facility. So I think it's an interesting perspective, and it leads me to the H2 plus trajectories. I mentioned the scenario related to 100% renewable energies. In fact, all the scenarios that try to look at the decarbonization of our economies, they present three pillars. And one pillar is related to frugality, then to efficiency, and then renewable. The order is important because if we don't have the frugality reading grid from the start, it's almost impossible to develop it afterwards due to what the economists call the rebound effect produced by efficiency and circular activities. We have to promote frugality. Here also, I only have the graph for French people, but I think it's more or less the same for many European countries. It means that we have to reduce our ecological and carbon footprint per capita from around 10 tons equivalent CO2 per capita per year to less than 2 tons. So it means that there are tremendous challenges in terms of mobility, ecological renovation of buildings, again, food, agriculture. And there are some H2 plus trajectories that are proposed. Of course, choices in terms of H2 trajectories depend on the H3 that is envisioned and on the H2 strategies. So we have to lead to have discussions in our countries about the limits of sustainable growth or green growth. We need to destroy jobs in certain sectors and create others. And then there is a problem of uneven distribution of training opportunities. We have to promote green jobs and green skills and competencies. And these competencies are not only technical, but also psychosocial, emotional. And that's also a big challenge. And anyway, we have also to acknowledge that work will become more strenuous for many people. Just say a word about my own research on what I call corporate systemic responsibility, in order to highlight the fact that when we speak of corporate social responsibility, it's not enough. We really have to take into account, when we reflect on changing our entrepreneurial strategies, we have to try to make sure that financial objectives will be more consistent with extra financial objectives. It means that we have to consider these systemic responsibilities related to how we create economic and financial wealth and how we distribute it. So it has to see with taxation, with accounting standards, with wage distribution, with investment choices. And this aspect, most of the time, is not taken into account when we speak of CSR. And then, of course, we have to reflect on societal and environmental standards. But we have also to take into account these political responsibilities of companies, and more particularly on multinational corporations, because we know that their economic power translates in a political power, in order to make sure that some regulations are not put into place. So I just also very quickly say something about the duty of vigilance perspectives. In France, we have this law since 2017, And at the UN level, there are discussions for the past 10 years on a legally binding instruments to regulate the activities of transnational corporations. And it's really a big concern to see that European Union is against this binding instrument. Whereas, for example, for France, in fact, it would be in the best interest of French authorities to defend this binding instrument because we already have the law in France. But still, European Union has taken a stand against this. And many Catholic NGOs are active in order to defend this treaty. Well, just to finish, I've almost finished, to come back to logos with the 6 gates on logos, ethos, and dynamis, the educational issues, the role of humanities, the importance of narratives. What I mentioned is related to changing the regulations, changing our day-to-day life has to see also with the desire, the collective desires to change. And we are witnesses to the thirst of many young people for justice and meaning. Current economic training does not integrate ecological and social issues in a structuring way. Pedagogies are often not adapted and teachings can be out of touch. The need for creative and critical thinking is great. How can we form democratic emotions? How can we open up to the political friendship so much evoked by Pope Francis? This question is key as eco-anxiety is growing among young people who are not ready in some of our countries to face common harms. They are used to individual paths and choices. And I just mentioned a study on the Lancet Planetary Health. The survey carried out in May and June 2021 revealed that 75% of 10,000 young people who were questioned from 16 to 25 years old and from 10 different countries, 75% are afraid of the future and 56% believe that humanity is doomed. And my own, for example, a friend of mine wrote to me 2 days ago that his 18 years old daughter has decided not to go to university for the time being because he thinks that she wants to experience different projects. And she said, well, everything, we are not in a good path, so I want to see the world till it's still possible. And he's a doctor, and well, just to give one example of this situation. And so I think
sorry, but we have to conclude
yes,
now
okay,
because.
I conclude. Okay, and just to say that this has to see with promoting ecological virtues. And these ecological virtues may help us promote transformative paths. And these transformative paths have to see both with day-to-day transformation, with structural institutional transformation, and with inner transformation. And as Christian and church leaders, we can accompany, I think, all these transformations by promoting not only personal, but also collective discernments. It means acknowledging structural evils and our common and shared and differentiated responsibilities, and try to individualize our collective replies. And just to finish, as the Pope says, may our struggles and our concern for this planet, for these situations, never take away the joy of our hope. And thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll have time for some questions afterwards, and now I give the floor to Monsignor Crepaldi, who will introduce the second speaker.
Thank you. I have followed with great interest the contribution by Sister Cecile. And this brought to my mind that when the Dicastery for Justice and Peace, a working group was established to launch at European level the so-called social weeks. And as a matter of fact, they became European Social Days. And I do remember back in the day, already many, many years back, earlier, well, before basically the biblical deluge, the flood. So this working group identified these social days as a place of discernment in the experience in the church, but also as a place of cultural, let's say, accumulation in order to face the challenges in front of us. And we heard really the magnitude of these challenges, the scope of these challenges. And Sister Cecile has provided us with a socio-economic input, let's say, social and economic input when it comes to the challenges we must face. But now we will hear from Father Milos Lichner. He's a Jesuit father. And he will provide us with a more theological and anthropological outlook on the situation. And the main theme of these social days is transition. But now we have to reconsider this transition, I believe, also in light of the appalling situation that has emerged in Ukraine with the aggression by the Russian Federation. And Father Milos, he is a patrologist. He has many degrees. He taught patristics and also on behalf of the Slovak Bishops' Conference. He is involved in interreligious dialogue with Jews and Muslims, and until last year he was the president of the European Society of Catholic Theology. He wrote several books, and I would like to give you the floor without further ado. Thank you.
Revered audience, I greet you warmly and thank you for the trust. I've been honored with the invitation to participate at the third edition of European Catholic Social Days. We have been paying attention to the exploration of social challenges the Church needs to face in a modern and deeply transforming Europe in the time of the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine that has affected all of us and undermined all of our securities. We wish to reflect over our chances to support the process of rebuilding of Europe from a Christian perspective and search for possible ways of healing, according to words of Prophet Jeremiah 6:16. Thus says the Lord, stand by the earliest roads as the pathways of old, which is the way to good, and walk it. These third European Catholic Social Days want to pay attention to three fundamental themes: demographic shifts and family life, technological and digital transformations, and ecological changes. My role is to offer anthropological and theological impulses on these topics, considering the complexity of the social ecological crisis in Europe in the Church. Thus, I have prepared 5 cues and conclusion. Looking at modern Europe and the Church, we see many impulses indicating that it is in crisis. However, this is not the first crisis in the history of the Church, and it certainly will not be the last one. History demonstrates that there have been previously expressions of profound faith and gospel, love, but also signs of grave human weaknesses and sinfulness within our Church. The pandemic has accelerated many processes, both good and bad, and every simplifying answer would mean an expression of disrespect towards the complicated reality like the life of the Church and the way we would like to see it. Phenomena of the crisis that we are currently witnessing can thus be seen as impulses of God for reformatio, or reformation, understood by Yves Congar as a typical sign of the Church, and the history of the Church proves it. In the first impulse, I would like to substantiate the importance of our will to think and take steps, of our will not to remain passive. In the time of grave communism and persecution of the Church, Jesuit father and Nestor of Slovak Catholic theology, Emil Krapka, wrote a study entitled on the situation of our church as the transition of the Lord. He found an inspiration in the event from the Gospel of Luke 4:16-30, where the preaching of Jesus in Nazareth is described, including the effort of people from the synagogue to hurl him down from the hill on which the city was built, and his passing through the midst of them and going away. Emil Krapka emphasizes that this gospel event reveals the person of Jesus and his mission. Some people expressed consent with his words, others drastically rejected them. But Christ peacefully and firmly passed through various answers of people to his message of salvation and kept on walking. According to Father Krapka, this mystery of the Lord's transition has been imprinted on the history of the Church like a seal. Places, times, words, environments keep changing, but the transition of the Lord has been happening in all of them. Christ keeps walking the history of his Church, experiencing both approval and rejections. We are invited to follow in his footsteps and bear the word of salvation amidst kind words or sharp disapproval, because this is the transition of the Lord in our Church. When Emil Krapka wrote this study, there were people who decided to wait for a better time. But he, along with other men and women, religious and people involved in the underground church, decided to walk with the Lord. Together, they did admirable work in the church. Christ passes amidst us, and we should avoid the danger of remaining in a prefabricated past, where no elements of life's dynamism can be found. The church as a living organism is in motion, and its knowledge has been growing and corresponding with primal awareness, just like the genetic information of the adult body corresponds with the information of a primal, undifferentiated cell of a newly conceived human being. That is why I would like to recall the words of Vincent of Lerins, ancient author from the 5th century, and his work Commonitorium, when he left us 2 rules about dogmas. The first, frequently interpreted rule, underlined the necessity to stick firmly to everything that has been believed from the very beginning, everywhere and by everyone. The second rule, which didn't used to be interpreted so often, focused on growth and motion. Vincent presents the image of a child growing and becoming a man. This also applies to us. Thinking about the condition of Europe and the Church can lead us to temptation to dwell in an artificially created image of the past, to stagnate. We witnessed the attempts to stop, define our borders face to face with the other world, and to shut down in a fictitious past or wait for called better times that are never going to come, creating artificial certainties. But in such a case, we will watch Christ pass and remain without him. According to Gaudium et Spes, we are invited to scrutinize the signs of the times and interpret them so that we can respond in a language intelligible to each generation. However, this walking with the Lord means, in the second impulse, also a change in the view of ourselves. Emil Krapka put a clear emphasis on one possessive pronoun, our church. Sociological research, unfortunately, confirms that the common believer sees the church only as an institution that exists outside his or her personal world. This believer does not feel like a living member of an ecclesiastic community. He or she does not feel included in the meaning of the possessive pronoun our. We are aware of the fact that due to hundreds of years of battle for investiture, it is the battle for the freedom of the Church and its protection from the intervention of oligarchs. A certain ecclesiology focused on hierarchy has developed with the marginalizing of laymen. The battle of St. Augustine with the Donatists put emphasis on 2 realities. The first is the baptismal equality of all believers. For example, his Sermon 58, dedicated to catechumens, in which he reminds that both emperor and slave give God the name Father. The second reality concerns the Catholicity of the Church, the fact that it is not limited to any region or nation. Augustine of Hippo kept repeating endlessly that the Church is either Catholica, which means designated for everyone, or not at all. Isidore of Sevilla considered the Greek word ecclesia to be pertinent because the Church calls and gathers all the people. Paraphrasing Prosper of Aquitaine, who can say that it is always here for everyone who shows interest, considering no national, language, social, political, economic, or regional limitations. Knowing this, we affirm that the others who run towards us also represent a part of the body of Christ, of our Church. Hence, we may see the current refugee crisis as a blessing of God for a demographic winter in Europe. Those who are coming are people with life vigor. During the International Congress on Hope that was held here in Bratislava in 2019, Professor Regina Polak pointed out the example of Austria. Refugees who had to leave everything behind are full of hope, while many people in Austria are full of despair. The third impulse unreels from the book by Henri Godin and Ivan Daniel, published in 1945, under a very provocative title, La France, pays de mission. Today we see that the vision of Europe as a Christian continent is not true anymore. I think we can and must say that it has become a missionary continent, and the work of the Church must be similar to that in missionary countries. We can say with Rocco Buttiglione that we don't have a well-formed Christians in front of us whose passions are controlled by reason, who lives in the society that facilitates or at least does not impede the perception of right order of values and moral good. Pope Francis sees suffering people and their damaged lives, to which, however, we ought to announce a joyful message that God loves and invite them to unite with him and with the whole of mankind. Many of these people are not Christians, and one needs to consider their own culture and values. Some of them may have been baptized, but their evangelization was shallow. They may feel the magic of faith, but their Christian formation was insufficient or even totally lacking. For all of them, the Church has become a field hospital, often lacking the necessary instruments and facilities for providing care, where doctors are called to make difficult decisions and risk everything. There was time where such problems were encountered only in missionary countries. In this regard, a concept of graduality, graded adherence to the Church, can be thought over theologically. Several hints have been given by St. Augustine in his word, De Baptismo. The primal announcing of faith was mentioned in 1975 by St. Paul VI in his apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Nuntiandi. Modern man listens more willingly to witnesses than to teachers. And if he does listen to teachers, it is because they are witnesses. It is therefore primarily by her conduct and by her life that the Church will evangelize the world. In other words, by her living witness of fidelity to the Lord Jesus, the witness of poverty and detachment or freedom in the face of the powers of this world. In short, the witness of sanctity. The beginning of the first letter of John also says that we should announce what we have heard and seen with our eyes, what we looked upon and touched with our hands, what concerns the word of life. We are invited to share the testimony that we have experienced, because as theologians, we do not hand over a mere teaching. We hand over a reflecting testimony of our lives. And those whose opinion is different when it comes to culture or faith are not our enemies. They are people to whom we are invited through the baptismal order of Christ, through his order, to be his witnesses in the field of the New Testament, which is, according to the Gospel of Matthew, the Word, where we are supposed to sow the testimonial word of salvation. I just want to add that we are called to hand over sanctum, sanctity, and not sacrum, sacredness. I would say that the people to whom we are being sent are not our enemies. Creation of an impression of an enemy is rather common political strategy for maintaining the cohesion of certain groups, but it has nothing to do with the gospel, because Christianity has been built on the basis of an inclusive approach. Pope Francis said in his sermon during his apostolic visit to Prešov, Slovakia, that the witness who bears the cross in his heart and not just on his neck does not see anyone as his enemy. He sees all people as his brothers and sisters for whom Jesus sacrificed his life. For this reason, we must unambiguously reject any attempt to instrumentalize religion. It is the misuse of Christian symbolism by any political, economic or social powers. They don't believe that man has been created in the image and the likeness of God, but limit their perception of human being to numbers. Groups that turn religion into an instrument to achieve their own selfish goals often contribute to xenophobia and particularly anti-Semitism. Last but not least is the fact that the topic of announcing the testimony of faith is closely related to the topic of ecology. It is the social and environmental dimension of the crisis. While reflecting over the transmitting of the living faith to the other generation, we should not forget to think of the environment or the place where the living faith of this generation can be truly lived. The fourth impulse I would like to stress appeals to us who want to announce the testimony. The understanding of the term clericalism, often used by Pope Francis via Augustine's term Libido Dominante, which has been neglected for centuries. Augustine did not know the term misuse of power. He rather spoke about lust in relation to power. He does not understand libido as a natural state. If our perception of naturality is defined as man created by God on the way of unification, libido contains latent egoism, implicit pride dwelling on the level of the body, pride as a result of Adam's sin in the paradise. So, how are we supposed to understand libido? Man has been seeking the absolute in all of the creation from which he turned away. Therefore, it is a desire of the spirit choosing earthly goods over eternal ones. Such a man desires to own perceptible goods that cannot be owned by a single glance, neither as a whole. Hence the slavery of lust, the division of a man rooted in his own self. This deviation of will results in pride and avarice. Adam's heritage in the untamable desire to gain possession of everything that surrounds us. This conceited desire for everything remains unfulfilled because it can be sufficiently fulfilled only by God. But this is something that man can never acknowledge because of his pride. We should amend the prevailing opinion about libido, the term almost exclusively comprehended as exuberant sexuality. Libido, in the sense of concupiscentia carnis, represents only one of its meanings. Augustine names several of them in his work De Civitate Dei, the city of God: the desire for revenge, the desire for money, the desire for victory, the desire for glory, and finally, libido dominante, the desire for domination or power. that represents the basis for the theme of the City of God. Libido Dominante is the exuberant desire to dominate over others, one of the expression of pride and avarice that we inherited from Adam. Augustine emphasizes that the horrible water flow of helpless poverty, indifference, arrogance, hatred, and violence causes an air-splitting rumble around the world, and sexual temptation was and still is only a poor, unpleasant fogging. With Adam's fall, the soul lost the ability to love in an undivided act and to praise God in all of his creation. Man is driven by a dark force marked by a desire to control, own, and use all the good things created by God, to be thanked for and shared with others to achieve his subjective goals. Many things criticized by Holy Father Francis can be understood in the light of the term Libido Dominante. Even the war in Ukraine reveals the disaster of this Libido Dominante. It reflects in what we traditionally call infirmitas, spiritual infirmity, which remains inside us after receiving the sacrament of baptism. Church tradition recommends an ascetic battle, and Pope Francis encourages a radical living of the gospel. The fifth impulse of mine is related to appropriate reaction of us theologians. At first, we should beware of predetermined answers. We know that in the past, the position of the theologian was defined somewhere between learning and teaching the church, giving to the fact that he was aware of not adhering to any of these two groups. In general, a theologian was a professor nominated by church authority, controllable and dismissible. He was supposed to hand over strictly defined, unalterable teaching. He became professor through recognition of his co-professors, mostly when he transferred from giving lectures to writing. Authority made him a professor, and the reputation of his work made him a theologian. His scientific scope became wider. He should work in the area of questiones disputate, quod libetales, and even dubiae. But he always spoke to a strictly defined audience within strictly defined definition. The secular version of this model is still present at contemporary universities. However, the present differs from the past, barely even resembling it. It is rooted in the change of the perception of theologians' position after the Second Vatican Council. The theologian started to focus more on pastoral questions. He stopped being the one who hands over knowledge downwards and gradually became the voice of public opinion, a theologian who had to win the attention of his listeners. This development was associated with secularization and detraditionalization of both society and the Church in Western Europe, often wisely mentioned by Liebenbowe. The position of theologian became subject of transformation. If theology today does not provoke any interest, it is because it has lost its legitimacy. It does not speak the same language. The first and foremost task of a theologian should be the effort to understand the reason of this. Re-establishment of dialogue with modern times represents the crucial question for the future of theology and evangelization of the world. Hence the word of Christ in Luke 5:37-38. Likewise, no one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the new wine will burst the skins, and it will be spilled, and the wineskin will be ruined. Rather, new wine must be poured into fresh wineskins. This new wine is the teaching of Jesus. Old wineskins represents everything that opposes his word. According to Origen, It is not about Scripture that speaks about Christ, but about every interpretation according to letters and not according to the Spirit, which prevents the light of gospel newness to shine. Theological work should be a critical faith that starts with silent contemplation of Christ, who comes when the theologian renounces his claim to know everything, and does so in advance, recalling that the Father in heaven hides from the wise what he reveals to the little. He begs Christ to reveal his Father, from whom he will learn to know the Son. In the pilgrimage, the theologian descends from his cathedra to become a disciple among disciples, to walk with people and share their lives. As theologians, we filled the Western world with our speeches, and now this world has lost its knowledge of God, and apparently it has been losing even the desire to rediscover this knowledge. In this situation, the theologian's work on critical faith consists of emptying the theologian's mind, abandoning his certainties to regain the freedom to question his own knowledge of God, to be able to ask the world what has occupied the place previously inhabited by God. Conclusion. Therefore, we should try to substitute moralizing Christianity with therapeutical Christianity, according to the example given by tradition of the early church. Augustine understood the church as locus misericordiae et tolerantiae, as the place of mercy and patient mutual tolerance. This is the church that will look after the wounded. Instead of classic Roman saying, si vis pacem para bellum, if you want peace, get ready for war, it will proclaim, si vis pacem para justitiam, if you want peace, get ready for justice. Only then the words of the Psalm 85:11 will come true. Love and truth will meet. Justice and peace will kiss. Because God will never get tired of forgiving. Instead of Roman divide et impera, divide and reign, the Church must act in accordance with servi et adunare, serve and unite. Only then it will become a new leaven of European society, a new path leading out of a blind lie. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. We have time now for some questions. The questions may come from the room here. You just put your hand up, and can come also from the people who are just following by Zoom. So you can write a question in the chat, and it will come to us. So is anybody ready for a first question? You can ask question to one or the other, or maybe both, of our speakers. Maybe just to start something, I would like to ask a question to Sister Cecile, because you speak about the corporate systemic responsibility. I would like to know a little more about it, because and in what is different from the evolution of corporate social responsibility, because you here to go faster about that.
I answer now? Okay. Yeah. In a way, speaking of CSR as corporate systemic responsibility is consistent with the evolutions of the conception of CSR by the European Union. Because since 2011, CSR is no more conceived only as what a company does above the law, charitable donations, and what we have been used to in many countries where the company has its main activity and say, well, I will provide local population with roads or educational projects, etc. This was the old way to conceive CSR. Now CSR is the definition for European Union is the responsibility to deal with the impacts of the activity along the value chains. It means being able to appreciate the effects in different domains of the main activity of the company, the goods and the services that are provided, assess the harmful effects, and be in charge of repairing, compensating, and try to prevent these negative effects. And if we take this perspective seriously, it means that it's not enough to look at only the social and environmental standards. We also have to reflect on the accounting standards. It's a big issue, and at the COP20 and 26, there has been a board that has been set up, which is the complementary to the EASB, International Accounting Standards Board, that was the creation of some private companies, and that has defined the accounting standards all over the world. And you have now also the Board on International Sustainability, ISSB, I think, which has to try to complement these standards. Of course, we should aim at integrating into the accounting standards social and environmental aspects, and there are some efforts to do so, but for the time being it's quite marginal. But just to come about CSR conceived as systemic means integrating issues related to how I create economic and financial value and how I distribute it. That's why it's, I think, so important to think about this necessary convergence between financial and extra-financial goals. And for the time being, even if we have this new definition by the European Union, it's still soft law. So how can we try to put pressure on governments, parliaments, in order to integrate this in terms of regulations? And that's why I spoke of the due diligence law, or the binding, the treaty that is discussed at the UN level, that if we don't have this kind of decisions, in fact, we have companies that are in a very difficult situation because the current rules of the game are not up to the global ecological and social challenges.
Thank you. Yeah, we have one question in the room. Who's going? Another over there, others. So the microphone is coming.
May I ask in Slovak language?
Now I realized that many people who have fled their homes, 3 million within Ukraine, 2 million that have fled to other countries, and total that equals the population number of Slovakia, as if the whole Slovakia was displaced. And therefore I ask, how do we perceive the reassessment of our goals of transformation in this light? For example, environmental transition. I mean, reduction of gas and oil transport from Russia to Europe, or reopening of nuclear power plants in Germany? Can we also reflect on such issues? Thank you.
Who wants to answer?
So we are not the politicians, and every political decision is very difficult because there is always pro and contra. And I hope that our politicians, also those that are from Christian parties, will take everything in consideration to find appropriate answer. I cannot answer on their position because I am not a politician. I can give them only some kind of theological impulses to act, but I cannot decide.
Maybe what I can just say, and from my perspective, living in France, that I heard these past days many reactions concerning the necessary efforts that we have to make in our countries in order to reduce our energy consumption. And some people say, well, we should have done this with the COVID crisis, trying to reflect on different lifestyles. Again, I speak not for the poor people, but for people who can change their living habits. And for me, this situation means that if we want to promote solidarity measures, we really have to put ourselves in the question and see what steps we can initiate with others in our countries in order to be more welcoming to people who have fled their homes, and to be able to realize that these necessary changes related to less dependency for the time being, at least on the Russian gas, means also anyway reflecting differently on energy issues.
Thank you. I repeat that it is possible for those who are following the meeting by Zoom to ask questions with the chat, so you don't hesitate. But we have other questions here in the room, at the back and then after in front.
Thank you very much. My name is Nicola Speranza. I'm going to moderate the following session on demographic issues. So I wanted to hear a word on this transition with a specific question concerning this child-free movement. You mentioned the ecological footprint, but how we could respond to this child-free movement? I already have some ideas, but I wanted to hear your view on this.
I'm not sure if child-free movement. It means
people especially in Western Europe, are choosing not to have children because this would endanger the environment. Thank you.
No. If I just take the example of the Campus de la Transition, where we welcome many young people, that's one of the issues that creates huge debates among them. And we have proposed what we call in France a débat mouvant, moving debates, where you put in a room, you say, well, if you are for having children, you are on the one side of the room and the others on the other side. And it's always very moved by the fact that at least half of the students choose to be on the side where I won't have children, because I think the situation is doomed. And it's really so. We try to reflect on this, and I think it's an educational issue. Maybe to have the church has also spoken about responsible parenthood. And it means, what does it mean to have children today? And so be aware of our responsibilities with parenthood, but also help them reflect on what is life, and imagining a possible, a desirable future. If you are in this perspective of it's necessary not to have any children, something about the narrative in our societies is really threatened. So I don't have any answer. In a way, I think there are two different issues: the issues of demographic transition at a worldwide level, and here we know that if we if the level of education for families is increasing, you have the birth rate is reduced. So, well, that's a way to reflect on development and not. It's a very sensitive subject for all of us, but I think that we can reflect like this on increasing educational standards will help countries ensure the demographic transition. And having done many surveys in Nigeria, this question is really a huge question. But then in our Western countries, it's the other aspect. I think it's more reflecting collectively on our shared responsibilities and help young people be more hopeful about their future. But honestly speaking, the situation is so serious that part of me is also sometimes thinking that really, yes, we can have faith on our Savior, but we know that the situation is dramatic. And when we look at the figures concerning ecological situation and the effects on populations, we know that there will be very difficult years and decades. So we also have to face this situation. I think that's where we have to, well, ecological and social virtues have to be nurtured in our and also in higher education at all levels.
I would like to add some kind from path, because as the Romans said, nihil novi sub sole, nothing new under the sun. So in the 4th century, we can find in Cappadocia, among the Cappadocian fathers, their fight against some kind of Christian ascetic circles. They refused also children, because they say more the children will be born, more people will die. If more people will die, the death will be stronger than Jesus. So they refuse the children because of this ascetic reason, to weaken the death. So when I saw for the first time these people saying that we need to create a childless world, so I told to myself, nothing new for us Christians, theologians and historians.
Thank you. We had questions here in the room and another one after on the Zoom. So here in front.
No,
another one. Yeah. Okay.
Va bene. Metterò la domanda in italiano per Padre Milos.
I will ask the question in Italian for Father Milos. I belong to the Greek Catholic Romanian Church. You mentioned Professor Mil Kraka, and you said that occasionally an artificial past comes about, artificial certainties are created in order to await a better future which never seems to reach us. And then you said, all these things reach us due to the action of oligarchs. The question is, we try to help the poor. This is a never-ending task. And the question is, perhaps we need to begin to help the rich. Because I remember that when the Jesuits went to China, Matteo Ricci began to work only with officials. Because proceeding along this road, it seems that we will never end. This is my question. Should we begin to help the rich?
So this is, thank you very much for this question. It is not easy to answer. I can say from the experience of us Jesuits, we have some provinces in America South. Some of the provinces collapsed because of this question. Some of the Jesuits wanted to work with rich people, others wanted to work only with poor people. and they were never able to find a common language. So maybe the answer is in the middle of this. So we have to, because also many of rich people, in their hearts, they are very poor people. And maybe we can, the problem is not to help the rich people, but to work with the rich because they are rich and they have money and we need money. This is the problem. We need to look on them as also created by God and work with them and help them with spiritual exercises and so on to rediscover, because we can say from the tradition we have 4th century Greek fathers, they said, if you are rich, God gave you this that you can help to the poor ones. We have the homilies of Lion the Great, the Pope, always when he spoke to the rich people to help to those they don't have money. So this is our tradition, to speak to the rich people, to encourage them, and always opere eleemosinae in the tradition of the church was always that the almsgiving and is always pleasant to God if you give to the poor. There is always a lot of homilies of Saint Lion the Great, so maybe by this one we can start.
Thank you. Maybe we can take some questions now from the Zoom, and after we'll be back in the room. The first question, what could be the supportive and forward-thinking role of the Diaconia initiatives in this global situation of many challenges? What would help with systemic changes?
Diaconia, this is a very important word, as we know from the history of the church, that the deacons were created because the apostles didn't have time to spread the word of God. So the deacons were those who had to work on the social level. But after some centuries, it changed in the history of the church, and deacons were those who sing with the bishops. And they were on his right and left hand. But also we have a lot of testimonies from the early church that the bishop had always a deacon responsible for the social work in his dioceses. And it was his primary work to talk to his bishop where there are poor people in his dioceses. So maybe we have to rediscover, we can also say what Benedict XVI said, that the ordination to the priesthood is not the same as the ordination for diacony. So we have to take it seriously. The real role of the deacons in the church, not only as those who say homilies and baptize, but primarily work their responsibility on the social work, as it was always. This is nothing liberal. This is the real tradition of the church, as deacons always did in the tradition of the church. It was their work.
Thank you. And one question here in the room. Do you have the microphone? Over there. At the back? Okay, and after one here.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm Sarah Pranger. I'm the former president of the International Young Christian Workers. And I just wanted to ask Professor Lischner, I'm not sure if I understood quite well, because you presented the notion of Europe being a missionary continent, which I find quite striking. And of course, there is some message of dignity and of human rights, which Europe is certainly having something to say about to the world. But at the same time, we have to be aware of all the harm we do. And I think even in the presentation, which we had before, it was very clear about the bad role that Europe has in many global value chains, the ecological footprint that we have, and also not all human beings who are refugees are treated the same. So I was just wondering, how do you combine that, this sin actually we're doing, and this notion of Europe being a missionary continent? I'm not sure if I understood you well, but I wanted to clarify. Thank you so much.
My reflection started from the book La France Pays de Mission. It was a very provocative book when it was published in France in 1945. Many people refused it, but now we can say that Europe become also the missionary continent. We have a lot of people, they are baptized, they have sacraments, but they have no, they don't know what does it mean to be a Christian, what does it mean, how to live a Christian life. If you speak with a good priest, good age, not young as I am, they have a big experience. They speak about many people, they are like baptized atheists. So people, they don't know what does it mean to be Christian. They have been baptized, they have sacraments, but they never been evangelized. That's the problem. And we have to evangelize the word, not to give only sacraments. If I may to say, not to call me heretic, but the first word is to say the word of salvation of Jesus. And the second, if they accept the word that they were saved by Christ, we can offer them sacraments with this healing, everything, what is it inside. But the first, we have to evangelize, if I may say.
We have another question from Doom, from Gabriela. Professor Renoir mentioned the limitation of global warming to 2 degrees Celsius as the goal. But Pope Francis fights for the 1.5 degrees goal. Do we not need to align all our policies with the 1.5 goal?
Yes. In fact, when I was speaking of 2 degrees, I was mentioning the well below 2 degrees that was used by the COP21, and it's not very far from the 1.5 degrees goal. I think discussing a lot, but a member of the scientific Council of the Foundation for Nature and Mankind in France, and so I discussed with many climatologists, I don't know the right word in English, but people experts in climate, and all of them say, well, we won't never reach 1.5. It's just impossible. So, in a way, yes, we can aim at and saying that we have to fight and to struggle in order to lower our emissions, but even 2 degrees, it's most probably we won't be below 2 degrees. So I think we have to face this reality, and of course trying to, the discourse on mitigation and adaptation. Of course we have to try to reduce as much as possible our emissions, but we know that the current trajectories are completely out of, they are not at all convergent with these goals. So for me, speaking of below 2 degrees or 1.5 is the same thing. In fact, we know that the necessary changes are tremendous.
The question here, over there. Microphone? Yeah. He asked for a long time. Here, over there. Please.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Bishop Hogan from the Netherlands. In the early 70s, the Bishop of Rotterdam met Pope Paul VI. And the Bishop of Rotterdam asked to Pope Paul VI, Holy Father, how is the Church doing? And the answer of Paul VI was, the Church is doing fine, she suffers much. My question to Professor Lichner is, can the Church be, as a master in humanity and also a master in human suffering, accompany people worldwide in a spirituality of suffering? I ask this because you mentioned si vis pacem para justitiam, to suffer for justice and for peace in the world, to be with the people who are actually suffering, but also to be with the people who are asked to pay the price, to suffer for peace and justice. Could the Church, and how could the Church be accompany the people worldwide in the spirituality of suffering? Also, I ask this in the period of Lent. We celebrate Good Friday before Easter. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your answer. I will not give you, for your question, I will not give you exact answer because we are for this reason here to find common answers. I just wanted to give some impulses. But what I can say, there is an interesting work, a book from Rodney Stark. He's an American sociologist. And he said in his book that the evangelization of the early church was helped by social work of Christians during the pandemic times. So where the Christians helped to Christians and also to non-Christians. And the people were amazed why these Christians died for us who are pagans. And so the evangelization and social work in the early church were were linked together. And we cannot, because the communist temptation was, you priest, just stay in the church, close the door, and don't go outside of the church. Just proclaim in the church, give sacraments, don't speak outside of the church. And when we speak with this, we have also older Slovakian priests they remember the times from the communism when the priests work outside of the church with youth. It was a crime of the state for 3 years of prison. And now many Catholics would like these arguments are valuable than you. You just stay in the church, don't work in a social field. They are liberals, I don't know who is working. But in the tradition of the church, evangelization and social work are linked together with everything with consequences and so on. It was the church who founded the Caritas. It was not a secular word. And the people who supported gladiator wars, when they became Christians, gave money to the church to build hospitals and to help suffering people. So this is, I think, the path of thinking I would like to give.
Thank you. I think the time is up now for some time. We have to stop now. Thank you very much for two speakers. And we'll have lunch now, and we'll be back here in the room at 3 p.m. for the next session, 3 p.m. And we have, some gifts. You give it to